Technology is wonderful. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Paul. I have voice. As the children depart, I would like to ask you to jot down a telephone number. The number is 0871 430 944. Would you like that again? You don't even know why, but I'm giving you the number. 0871 430 944. Sabbath School is going to be just slightly different in our presentation this morning. We're going to have a panel up here on the platform, and that number is the number you can use to send a text message question. So do you want it again? Those of you who didn't bother to write it down, you want it again, because if you want to be able to ask a question, that's the way to do it this morning. So the number one last time, and then it will be up on the screen. It's up on the screen. There you go. They've got it there already for you. So if you want to text a question at any point during the lesson, that's the number to use, and hopefully the technology will work for us. The Sabbath School this lesson is Saul to Paul. What's in a name change? The Apostle Paul is known to us all as the man who went around sharing the gospel far and wide. But where did Paul come from? Because he wasn't always Paul. He used to be Saul. And as we think about this week's lesson, what we've been looking at during the week and what we're going to try and focus on this morning, we want to find out what made the difference to this man. What moved him from what he was to what he became for God. So I'm going to invite the panel to come up here. I can't see any of them. Yes, I can. Ernestine Finley, please come up and take a seat. And the mics are all here. Llew Edwards, Pastor Llew Edwards, come up and take your seat. And Pastor Weiers, you're coming up to join us, I believe. And Pastor Victor Hulbert. See, this is why I don't want cables. So have a seat, Victor. There we go. That one's unwound. Yes. That one's unwound. That one's unwound. And, oh, but look at that. So who else wanted no wire? There we go, Teeny. Ladies can be the convenient one. So we've got a panel here, and I'm going to ask a few questions just to get you started, and then you can start sending your questions in. Panel. According to the Bible, Saul came from Tarsus. Doesn't sound a very Jewish town. How come he was born in Tarsus?
I guess Tarsus was much like Dublin. It was a very cosmopolitan place. I'm looking here this morning and I'm seeing people from all sorts of backgrounds. So Paul may have been a Jew, but he was part of that diaspora that lived outside of Israel.
Okay, so Paul's parents were Jews, but they lived in a cosmopolitan town. So did they bring Paul up to be Jewish or Roman?
Both.
Both. Pastor Llew. Both. What do you mean?
Well, and later on he studied under Gamaliel, who was a leading Jewish scholar. So he clearly was brought up as an educated Jew.
Which would mean what, Pastor Llew? Where would it start?
Oh, he would have known the Old Testament practically off by heart and able to speak from the Old Testament very clearly.
And when would that training have begun?
From childhood?
From childhood. So all those children who've gone out to Sabbath school lessons, they're following Paul's footsteps. They're being taught the scriptures. Okay, but Paul was quite proud of his heritage, wasn't he?
Speaking as somebody who lives in a diaspora as well, I think that you actually begin to value your roots more when you're not in the center of where it all is. In the center, you can afford to be a bit rebellious and think about other things, but probably out there on the margins where you're in the minority, you actually begin to value your faith even more, and you might even become more zealous in about it.
Indeed. So here we have Saul, I suppose we should call him Saul back then, because that's what he was. Saul grew up in Tarsus. You know, he'd gone to synagogue every week with his parents. He'd been taught the Old Testament scriptures. He then, at 12 probably, went to Jerusalem to study in Gamaliel's school. What was the result? What did he become? Don't forget, you can ask questions too.
I think attending Gamaliel's school is like attending Trinity College. Everybody wants to go there. It's the Princeton of... He was a really well-educated person.
So he goes to the place where there is the center of learning, where the knowledge of Judaism and all that meant is really focused on. He learns the scriptures in a great depth. What's the result to the way he lives?
He becomes the Jewish Mark Finley.
Now, you'll have to unpack that a bit, because what's the Jewish Mark Finley look like?
Well, it's the Jewish Mark Finley before Mark Finley was converted, with no disparity on you, sir. But he was at the top of his game in terms of knowledge, very well educated, good degrees, good pedigree. He had everything going for him. But he hadn't got terribly much tolerance. I must distance this from your husband. I'm digging a hole here. He didn't have terribly much tolerance for anybody who thought differently than the way he thought.
But that's what conversion does, because when Paul was converted, the same zeal that he had in persecuting the Christians, that same zeal he had in presenting Christ and preaching Christ. And so it can be carried over to conversion.
Thank you for helping me there.
But you know, he also was able to quote secular authors. So his education wasn't narrow.
It wasn't narrow.
He must have had a broad education as well.
Yep. Broad education. I've got a few questions coming in, but I'm not going to ignore them, but I'm going to hold a couple of them until we get to that point. Okay? We haven't quite got to where the questions are yet. So we're going to carry on with his education. What sort of person did he become as he left this school?
Say that again.
Okay. Well, did he just, you know, I mean, he had a trade. Did he just be a tent maker in a quiet place, looking out for himself, just going to synagogue once a week and, you know, living a right life quietly?
No, he was a Pharisee as well. So he was a leader. He was a Pharisee.
All right, he was a leader. He wasn't just a Jew. He was a Pharisee.
But he was a zealot. He was an evangelist of the top drawer within Judaism, wasn't he?
Yep. And he came to hear about these people who were following after some heretic.
It's quite amazing to me that even though he was zealous and he was climbing up that ladder, it is as though his character, that same thing that gave him the drive, also probably gave him an edge that made him dangerous, or that he could become violent and become... is not a person who has a lot of compassion on other people as such.
This is an interesting question that we can drop in right now. How come Paul wasn't mentioned in the Gospels? Anybody got an answer for that one? Didn't he hear about Jesus before Jesus was ascended to heaven?
I guess if you come to Acts chapter 2, you find 3,000 people converted in one day that were not mentioned in the Gospels. Throughout the book of Acts, you meet tens of thousands of people that weren't mentioned in the Gospels. In fact, there are many, many miracles that were not mentioned in the Gospels. John says, if everything that happened with Jesus was written, there wouldn't be enough ink to write all the books.
Yep.
Is that a good enough answer?
I don't know. Is that a good enough answer? It seems to actually indicate that there's lots of things in the Gospels, but not everything was recorded there. And certainly John says exactly that. He only chose bits because he wanted to get across a specific message. But Paul does come on the scene in the early days of the church, doesn't he? What's he doing when he comes on the scene? I don't like this phone. Sorry, Edith.
When he comes to the early church, he's zealous for his faith. In fact, in Colossians it says, "Him we preach and him we warn every man." And he says, "To this end I labor." And so he labored vigorously to preach Christ when he eventually when he came to know Jesus.
Yeah.
And so that catapulted and helped the early church. It catapulted it ahead.
It did.
And I guess in a practical way, we need that same zeal today to catapult the church ahead in our culture.
We do. And so looking at that change for Paul, where he's zealous for Judaism and all that means, where heretics actually, what was his opinion of heretics?
Persecute them and get rid of them.
Yeah, okay. So really Paul is saying, if you don't agree with me and all that I believe in, you have no right to an opinion. Ouch, that's a bit strong, isn't it? But Pastor Llew, if you disagree with me, I'm going to have you arrested and thrown into prison. So be careful before you speak.
I'm interested in the zeal because Jesus talks about the Pharisees as crossing land and sea to make a convert and making them twice as fit for hell.
Yeah.
So I think it depends on the kind of zeal they've got. And I think zeal can be wrongly applied.
Okay, so here's a question or comment from the audience that leads into a question. Quoting Ecclesiastes 1 verse 18, much knowledge is much sorrow. The question is, did Saul learn too much that made him too fanatical?
I think you've got to balance things, that Saul was a man of passion. He wasn't, as you indicated earlier, he wasn't the kind of person that just sat down in the pew and let things happen. I think whatever he did in life, he threw his heart and his soul into it. So I'm not sure that's linked to book learning. Otherwise, we could have the same danger sitting here. We believe that people that go into ministry shouldn't just do a 2-week course or a 3-month course. They should go and study and learn to debate, learn to reason with people that have a different viewpoint than my viewpoint. And all of that is important. But you can get the book knowledge and only apply it in a very narrow way. Mm-hmm. So it's getting the balance between the two.
It is indeed. So here's Paul with his book knowledge and his zeal, and it was a zeal for God. He tells us it was a zeal for God. He has this zeal for God, and he's persecuting the followers of Jesus. And in Jerusalem, he's done a good job so that those who aren't Jerusalem Jews have scattered. And then he wants to go further afield. So he gets letters from the General Conference to go. He's a Jew. And he's going to deal with the heretics. And the question comes, So he has a Damascus Road experience. Whoops, lost it. He has a Damascus Road experience. Is he given an unfair advantage? How many people here or around us get a Damascus Road experience?
God works with different people in different ways. And so if God knew that that's what Paul needed for his conversion, that's what he gave him. And so if he knows that we need something else for our conversion, then he will give that to us too. So God is not unfair. God is just all-knowing, and he knows exactly what we each need individually.
Yeah, absolutely. So this zealous Pharisee, God needed to get his attention somehow, didn't he? And that's why the Damascus Road happened. God's trying to get all of our attention all the time. And as Teeny says, he uses different ways. But having got Paul's attention, what did God do? Go and wait. Didn't he? Go and wait. God didn't say, right, Paul, now, this is going to be the outline of your life. He didn't start to dictate everything Paul was going to be.
And I think that's actually one of the important points that I picked up from this lesson, and coming back to the question about the book learning, because Saul was this Pharisee, he had got all of this learning, he has this dramatic experience on the Damascus Road, and then he goes away and studies for 18 months. Was that Damascus Road really real? Was it just a hallucination? Was what was spoken to me then really the thing? Let me go away and study the scrolls and study and compare it with everything I've known up till now and make sure I've got it right before I go back to Barnabas and the others and really get that calling to mission.
Okay, so not only did God get Paul's attention on the Damascus Road, and I mean there's a couple of things that we could look at on the way, but you've taken us ahead slightly. He actually had quite a long period of time when he was completely out of the public view. He had a little bit of time when he was in the public view, and then he goes into the background for a while so that he can really put it together and understand for himself just where he ends up being. So, why then... wrong one. I've read that one already.
Paul, can I interrupt?
Yes, of course, please.
Isn't it a reality that every one of us gets a call? Everybody needs to encounter Christ, and he does it different ways, as Teeny says, but every single one of us is called to share the good news with other people, aren't they?
And different things happen to us that lead us to make choices one way or another. Point made here from somebody, thank you. When Saul was there as a representative witness of the Sanhedrin watching Stephen be stoned, what was the impact on him?
What was going on inside his head, I'm not sure we're really told, but one of the things that strikes me is, why does God sometimes call people that we would say, shouldn't be calling that guy? I mean, Ananias says it. God, this is the wrong man you're calling. Yeah. Matthew, the tax collector, why would he call people that... And I'm wondering if there's a missional strategy there that we sometimes miss, you know?
I just want to... I hear you, Pastor Llew, but this question came in, and I just want to develop it a little bit more. When Jesus meets Paul on the Damascus Road, he says it's difficult for you to fight against your inner convictions. But Paul's inner conviction was that Judaism was right. But what he had witnessed with Stephen was also a conviction, because the way Stephen behaved was the ideal of Old Testament living. You forgive your enemies. Even when somebody badly uses you, you wish them well. And Paul couldn't put that together. How can a heretic behave in a way that's better than me? So then God gets his attention on the Damascus road. He's sent into Damascus and left blind for 3 days. But in that 3 days, he doesn't eat, he doesn't drink. He prays a lot. I am absolutely certain he goes through all the teachings he ever had at Gamaliel's knee. He's trying to put it all together. This Jesus is the Messiah. So, why doesn't God carry on speaking to him and say, right, you don't need any human interaction? Although Paul says, I didn't actually learn anything I learned from Peter and the apostles. You don't need, why did he send Ananias? Again, somebody's asked that question, but not in that way.
One thing is that Ananias acted as Christ and also as a minister of what we have today. The lesson brought that out very clearly, that that was the role of Ananias. And so he needed that direction at that point.
Yeah. Was Ananias willing?
No, not at first.
Yeah. I think Ananias must have been a very special kind of person, because if you face your arch enemy, oftentimes we set ourselves up to confront and to fight. And I can just imagine Ananias wondering, what is he going to encounter when he gets this enemy of Christianity over there? And maybe the Spirit was working with him and saying, Paul now needs somebody who can. Paul is feeling vulnerable. He can't see. All his power is falling apart, and he needs somebody to carry him and support.
Yeah. I find it really interesting that, Ananias comes and in that 3 days, something special happens. His sight is restored. So you can say there's two supernatural events. I'm touching on a question here. Two supernatural events happen, and Paul's response is, I need to make a public commitment to Jesus. I need to be baptized. I think that's incredible. Now the question then is, why don't we still see influential people getting such dramatic supernatural experiences? Surely if that was happening today, the world would notice. That's some question.
You've managed to silence everyone with that.
Absolutely everyone.
But is it happening in some parts of the world that we might not know about in our little culture or our little sphere of influence? Because God is leading people from around the world. We see this as we travel even in different cultures, that God is dramatically leading people, even the way that he led Saul to become Paul.
Yeah, Pastor Llew.
The great Saul becomes Paul because a simple disciple called Ananias is willing to do what the Lord tells him to go do. And maybe if us simple people would make more contact with some of the great people, maybe the great people would step out and shine.
Yeah.
I wonder if there is space for us to say that in the beginning, when the church was so small, before there was such a thing as Christendom, today we've got the whole world is living in a state where Christ has been preached in places, and God needed to kickstart it and catapult his movement, and perhaps that is why it has come down in that way to us. And maybe each person that comes to Christ today is just as significant, but because we're in a much larger situation, we don't really pick up on it.
Sure. So the point of Paul being made blind and left blind for 3 days gave him the opportunity to think and reflect on everything he knew. no distractions. So maybe that's why he was blind. A simple man like Ananias comes and helps him see and reflect on Jesus. What's happened to Paul's zeal for God?
The zeal's unchanged.
Okay.
But it's a time of reflection.
It's just given a new direction. You're right. There's nothing changed about Paul's desire for God to be shown to be right. Paul still wants people to come to know God and to serve him correctly. But now something has changed.
There's a change from a relationship with a set of beliefs to a relationship with a person.
Yeah.
Isn't that?
Yep. I would agree with you, Pastor Llew.
Acts 9, verse 20 says, immediately he preached the Christ in the synagogues, and he is the Son of God. So immediately after this experience, he has that zeal, that same zeal he had before to persecute the Christians, he now has to preach Christ and to tell that he's the true God.
So whereas he was going in this direction with all of his passion, he's now going in this direction with all of his passion. Whereas he was talking to the Jews to get support, he's now talking to the Jews to point them to the Messiah. So he's staying with his own people and trying to help them see what has happened to him. What's the result in Damascus?
I'm not sure that I understood the question.
All right.
Of the
so he's gone to the Jews in Damascus with this zeal to say, you know why I was coming, but now I'm this. Why am I this? Because Jesus is the Messiah.
Yeah.
What's the result?
A certain level of fear.
Yeah. Hey, you know, we need to get rid of this guy. we can't have this. That's interesting, isn't it? So he ends up going to Jerusalem. You know, they get him out of Damascus, get him away safely. He ends up going to Jerusalem, and he wants to meet up with the leaders of the way. He wants to meet up with the disciples. And how do they feel?
They feel like they aren't quite sure whether he has a true conversion, so they're a little standoffish, they're a little leery of his experience at first.
I've got to backtrack. I've got a question come in which I'd missed. As I say, I'm finding it's difficult to see when the questions actually come in. This question's come in. Paul was baptized after just 3 days. Why does it take our church months and months and months to study with someone? I think it's a good question, so thanks.
I think Paul already basically had the belief sorted out. It was a relationship to Christ, and that doesn't need months and months and months. You can have a relationship with Christ today.
Yeah. It depends what you're changing from and to. If you have no knowledge to if you have a lot of knowledge, and all that's needed is the relationship. Because at the end of the day, baptism is not about the knowledge, it is about the relationship. Baptism is not about being baptized into a set of beliefs of understanding, but into a living relationship with Jesus. So thank you, whoever sent that question. Sorry it took me so long to get to it. So now we get to Jerusalem. Somebody risks something, don't they? Somebody mentioned him earlier. I think it was Eugene, Barnabas. Barnabas takes a risk and goes and meets up with Paul. What was the risk? What was the risk?
Whatever the risk was, and there was the risk that Paul might just be an infiltrator, a spy, something coming like that. But you've got to give Barnabas the credit, and something that we really need in the 21st century, of sitting down beside people that we're not necessarily comfortable with and opening up our homes and our hearts to them and saying, you know, I'm interested in you as a person. I'm willing to take the risk. I'm willing to befriend you. I'm willing to see what will happen. I'm willing to go on a journey with you.
Do you think Barnabas had friends who Paul had thrown into prison? It's highly likely, isn't it? So Barnabas, in effect, took the risk of giving Saul, the benefit of forgiveness without the full evidence that the man was changed. Took him and introduced him to Peter and the others. What's Paul, because he is now Paul, what does he start to do? Or continue to do?
Share Christ.
Share Christ. Where? He's in Jerusalem.
Right, but he is also called to go to the Gentiles.
Yeah, but before that, he's in Jerusalem, so who does he go to?
It says he boldly preached in the name of the Lord, and he spoke and disputed against the Hellenists. They were seeking to kill him, so they take him down to Caesarea and send him off to Tarsus again.
Okay, so he starts sharing this change in him in this zealous way with the Jews in Jerusalem. And there are some who are not from Judea, who are Jews in Jerusalem, that he upsets by sharing this news. Shouldn't have been a surprise, really, should it? Because he'd have been upset if somebody had done it to him a few years before.
It's interesting that the disciples are afraid of him, and it's the same fear that makes them lower him in a basket and take him away from Jerusalem, send him off to Tarsus. I wonder if they hadn't done anything, whether Paul would have said, "Hey, bring it on. I'm ready for all the trouble you can throw at me." Because he is one of the questions I have about Paul is, what enables a person to take a stoning and a beating and get up and say, "But I still want to preach this gospel"? And, where is he that he's stoned? Lystra. Yeah. That he's stoned, and he gets up and goes back into the city. Yeah. Most people would have said, "I think I won't do this anymore." Yeah. He's just uncrushable. Yeah. Isn't he? Amazing passion for Christ.
Absolutely. There was nothing that was going to deter him. But he ends up leaving Jerusalem, going back to Tarsus. Estimates of how long it are between 8 and 14 years. That's a long time, isn't it? But in Tarsus, I'm sure he's not quiet, but we don't have any word about what he was doing there. But his relationship with Christ was being solidified during that time. Question here which relates to the risk that Barnabas took, or a statement really, just to get us thinking about the application to ourselves. I think that the risk Barnabas took is powerful in the light of the current refugees crisis. Do we need to think more about the people and be less cynical and more loving? I'm not sure that that's a question that's easy to answer, but it's a point based on what Barnabas did. And when Barnabas is later up in Antioch, where the persecuted Christians that were Greek-based have spread out from Jerusalem, they're getting settled back in their own places and sharing the gospel, not just with Jews, but with Gentiles as well. And Barnabas goes looking for Paul and brings him back to Antioch. What's the result?
I'm just reflecting back to I wasn't listening fully to you. I'm thinking about these refugees and the things that come into your mind when you see these stories in the media, and then thinking about the neighborhood where I live and the way the demographics have changed in my own neighborhood over the 15 years I've been living there, where 3 of my neighbors, the house directly opposite me is now Polish people, where the women seem to speak English and the men kind of just wave at me when I speak to them. The house next door is Lithuanian, where again the ladies seem to speak English, and the men, their English is very limited, and the house behind me is Polish. And so I've had those come into my community, And when I walk the dogs around the park in the evening, when there's people sitting on the benches, a few years ago when I said hello to them, they replied. Now I say hello to them and they grunt because they're scared to get into conversation with me. And I'm challenged on that level of how do I witness to people where I can't even speak the same language as them, and how do I build bridges with them? And then equally, when I read these reports and see these horrific tales of people coming out of Syria, and I can't imagine how it must be to be in that kind of circumstance and to have to drag myself across Europe to try and find refuge somewhere, and then the politicians stand up and make statements about it, and it kind of dehumanizes it. And I think, how does my Christianity react to that? I know Newbold and a pastor in South England are heading down to Dunkirk, because we hear a lot about Calais and the crisis there, but there's equally a crisis in Dunkirk, and they've chosen to head down there, and ADRA France has started a feeding program there, and I see things like that, and I think, that's where our humanity needs to be. That's where the Barnabases come in.
So the comment that's come in, based on that, the Christian world lives in fear of accepting the immigrants because they're mostly Islamic, is a challenge for us in saying, well, even if they're Islamic, they are people in need. And shouldn't my Christianity reach out to their need, irrespective of their particular background? So that's really what you're touching on, and certainly, we as a church through ADRA are seeking to try and address that to some extent.
If I think there's a church, certainly several years ago, in the Welsh Mission, where the church is on a row of Victorian houses, which was almost exclusively Asian Muslims that were there, and those kids were just playing football in the street. They had nowhere to play, and the pastor said, with the very grudging permission of the church board, they weren't happy about it, can we open up the church hall on a Monday night so the kids can come in and play five-a-side football? And he developed a real relationship with those kids when they're 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, when they're strapping 6-foot guys. They're not running off to Islamic State. They may not have become Adventists, they may not have become Christians, but they've seen a positive side of Christianity. They will sit on the wall and have a chat with the pastor, rather than saying, I don't trust you. It's building the bridge.
It is, building a bridge.
Paul, I think the times in which we live, we mustn't make our responses based on fear. It's time for us to pray for courage.
Absolutely.
In situations, rather than deliverance from situations.
Absolutely.
God, give me the courage to be your person at this time, in this situation.
There's another question that's come in that I want to get to, and I've just been given the hand, which means it's already like this, At Antioch, Paul and Barnabas did a great work in reaching out, not just the Jewish community, but everybody who lived in Antioch. So many people became followers of Jesus, and it caused a little bit of a disruption among the Jewish church, because primarily at that time, just as Paul had been, the followers of Jesus were Jews with a Jewish cultural mindset. Now, you are all here in Dublin from lots of different cultural settings, and you all come with a particular cultural outlook that's moulding your Christianity. Paul and Barnabas are sent to Jerusalem to talk with the leaders there, to come to some understanding. Does everybody who comes to Christ have to become a Jew in order to be a part of us? It's an amazing question. What were the core elements that the church had to grapple with? Should they be circumcised? Should they keep the feasts? Should they, all these important things, should they wear a tie on Sabbath? No, sorry. We have these important things too as Adventists. And I think this is an important one for us to look at right in closing, sadly. What is the real core that we cannot leave off?
Well, one thing for sure was there were biblical absolutes, and there's a difference between biblical absolutes and culture.
Yep.
And so we have to determine what are those biblical absolutes, and we hold to them no matter what the culture is.
Sure.
And there are other things that we're very tolerant with in different cultures because people do different things, different ways in different places.
So you've put your finger on it, Teeny. There are biblical absolutes. Now, to a Jew, circumcision on the 8th day was a biblical absolute. What did the Council of Jerusalem decide?
They talked grace, to be honest, and yet circumcision was one of them. But it's even interesting to go beyond that, and Paul goes on as we go further through the book of Acts and into his writings, and even what you could say was the liberal interpretation that was given in the Council of Jerusalem. Paul even said that's too difficult. And it really does come down to the knowledge and living the life of Christ, giving ourselves totally to Christ. And the absolutes, in a sense, start to take care of themselves.
Yeah. And so the church, I mean, I'll call it the church in Jerusalem grappled with what are the absolutes. They came up with 4, but principle was, if these people have accepted Jesus and the Spirit is changing their lives, they are part of us. Now that's an amazing thing, isn't it? It's an amazing thing for us as a church today, living in an increasingly secular world that struggles with absolutes. I mean, the truth of the matter is, it does struggle with absolutes. If we come along with a set of absolutes rather than a relationship with a loving God, we're unlikely to make much headway. So how do we know where to draw the line?
I think when I see the one refrain that I see in Paul all the time is make every effort to live in harmony with the people around you. And I feel that if those absolutes that we have, which I believe is Jesus Christ, helps us to become good people and nice people and loving people, it's probably in the right direction. If it makes us angry and if it makes us confrontational like Paul used to be, we need to think again.
Yeah, thank you.
Paul, the only absolute there is in the universe is God.
Yeah.
Full stop.
Absolutely.
And his character and the attributes of his character. We need to work out the difference between understanding his character and applying that in situations.
Yep.
So the absolutes are grace, love, peace, kindness, gentleness, describing God's, because he's the only absolute.
Yep.
And I think Paul never forgot where he came from. No. He never forgot the harsh, judgmental person he was as Saul of Tarsus. And as you go through his letters, and the older he gets, the more gracious he becomes, the more concerned he is for a slave called Onesimus, the more concerned he is for people that are struggling. Even when he's in prison in Rome and he's writing his letters and he's saying, look after this person, look after that person. And when he comes to the end of his life and he's saying, chief of sinner though I be, the grace that has come through, he hasn't compromised on anything, but the grace that has come through because the love of Christ has filled his life has made him into the greatest missionary we've ever known.
And if you want the biblical absolute for what has just been said in summary, turn to Philippians 3, verses 8 to 14. And I'm just lifting out the highlights. I count it all as nothing the surpassing value of knowing Christ Jesus, my Lord. Not having a righteousness of my own that comes from the law, but one that comes through faith in Christ, the righteousness from God based on faith. Forgetting what lies behind and straining forward to what lies ahead, I press on towards the goal for the prize of the heavenly call of God in Christ Jesus. Finally, brethren, and I'll add sisters, whatever is true, whatever is honourable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is pleasing, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, and if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. Keep on doing the things you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, and the God of peace will be with you. Amen. Thank you, panel, very much for your contributions. Apologies if you sent in a question that didn't get answered. I'll blame the technology. But thank you for those who did contribute and help add to our discussion.
Thank you, Paul, and your team.